Hi, I am Jennifer Purcell, and welcome to my podcast, Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge, where we will discuss, discover, and learn more about the challenges and triumphs of those with NLD and other learning challenges. I do have a website for this podcast, and it is called livingwithnld.com. I also have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter account for the podcast. They are all under the same name, which is Living with NLD. I also have a YouTube channel for the podcast, which can be found by Googling the title of the podcast, which is Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. I would like to tell you about a nonprofit that I use for my research for this podcast. It is called the NVLD Project, and I use their blog for my research. They are a nonprofit that is based in New York and is trying to get NVLD back on the DSM, and they provide many resources for people with NVLD on their website. I'll provide you with the website for them in the podcast description. All proceeds from the ads on this podcast will be donated towards the NVLD project. Please feel free to explore the other topics on the podcast, and hopefully you will learn something new from them. I hope you enjoy today's episodes. All right, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're listening from. I'm Jennifer Purcell, and I'm here with Andrew Hill today to ask him some questions about neurofeedback and his business Peak Brain, and I'll have him start by introducing himself.
Well, thanks for having me. Nice to be here. Of course, my name is Andrew Hill. I'm a neuroscientist that helps people understand their brains. We do things like brain mapping, and we also help people make changes using both lifestyle sort of biohacks as well as specific tools like neurofeedback, which is a process of training the brain to make changes in executive function, anxiety, sleep, broad features like that, essentially. So yeah, I own Peak Brain, and we are a brain gym, and we teach people to understand themselves and so take agency, understand yourself without necessarily rushing to that diagnosis, but understanding the executive function, the sleep, the stress, the speed of processing, specifically how they might operate for you, regardless of what somebody calls that particular, landscape or diagnosis for you.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about QEEG mapping, what that is.
Sure. So brain mapping, or QEEG, is a process of picking up the baseline sort of fingerprint patterns that you will produce in your brain. Usually we combine, it's good practice to combine a brain map, which is a physiological measurement, an EEG basically. It's good idea to combine that with a performance measurement. So best practices is to do some sort of executive function testing, a go, no go style test alongside the EEG. And when doing an EEG, you put a cap on the head or you stick 24 wires to someone's scalp, and then you measure their brain at rest for about 10 minutes eyes closed and 10 minutes eyes open. And the stuff we're measuring, those big patterns, are not the content of thought or little experiences you're having. It's the standing resources, the stuff that's usually there. So brain mapping is a little tricky to interpret, but it's always the same unless you're pushing your brain around. Performance testing is easy to interpret, but it's sensitive to how you're feeling that day a little bit. So those two things held in contrast, and both are compared to age-matched samples. So everything's sort of bell curve driven, where in performance, it's pretty straightforward. If you're inattentive or impulsive, or if you have difficulty with auditory versus visual, or a reaction time issue, or a stamina issue, that jumps out in performance. But then you look at a brain and you're like, great, well, you're weird in these 3 ways. Good job. Be weird. We don't necessarily know what it means because people are so unusual.
Right.
However, stuff that gets in the way in executive function, especially, several flavors of anxiety, sleep dysregulation, and a few other things that might be interesting to the folks who listen, including sensory processing, social processing, will show up pretty clearly. Other things might not, like you can see sometimes language-based phenomena like dyslexia. But like, for instance, I'm profoundly dyscalculic. don't have any math areas in my brain. I have two language areas, bilateral, and no math area. You're supposed to have language on the left and math on the right, theoretically, for the symbol
Okay.
manipulation areas. I got two language areas and no math areas. So I just cannot
Mm.
do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division in my head without it being like a foreign language, and I have to translate in and out and make lots of mistakes. But I don't see a quirky back right area in my brain maps because it's
Mm-hmm.
working fine. It's working typically. It's just not doing math. It's just doing other symbol manipulation for me. So you can't see everything in a brain map, and you don't see all your suffering. If you're really concerned about something, you don't see it on a map, doesn't mean it's not there. Your experience is real. But
Mm-hmm.
if you do see big features sticking out for executive function, anxiety, sleep, sensory, social, speed of processing, stability phenomena. You can sometimes see migraine tendencies or seizure tendencies. These are the things that you can sort of start working on like it's your body. You can sort of say, great, I would like to change my impulsivity or my
Mm-hmm.
reaction time or word finding. And you can actually exercise the tissue, the brain, using biofeedback on the brainwaves. So QEEG is an EEG that's processed compared to population averages. But since you see those patterns that might represent difficulties or complaints or goals you have, well, then great. You can now exercise those features you're seeing with biofeedback and make changes over a few months.
Okay. Um, I was curious kind of what got you into doing neurofeedback and how long you've been doing it.
I've been doing it for about 25 years.
Wow.
And I've been running my own companies for about half that time.
Mm-hmm.
And 26 years ago, let's say, I was working in psych hospitals, and I had had about a decade of really deep experience with pretty much all of the really acute human suffering stuff.
Mm.
So I was doing inpatient lock facility hospitals with psychiatric complaints and violence and drug abuse and all kinds of things. I was also running residential facilities for folks with multiple disabilities. Usually they were blind, deaf, no language, and had CP or some sort of other developmental issue that was really in the
Mm-hmm.
way. So these people had communication, perception, and sort of cognitive challenges usually,
Okay.
and just really extreme edge cases. And then same thing in the hospitals I worked in, really, really violent hospitals, like the worst in the country, essentially for managing people at acuity levels.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got injured,
Mm.
and I couldn't keep doing the work that I was doing. So I spent some time doing other things, working in high tech, and then I eventually said, I kind of miss working with people, and I have a lot of experience working with autism and other developmental populations. Oh, there's a place nearby that does this thing called neurofeedback. I'm kind of interested in that. Let me go and see if they'll let me observe. And I
Mm-hmm.
walked out with a job.
Wow.
And spent a couple of years doing this work. And I had a lot of experience with autism, ADHD, childhood anxiety, childhood sensory issues and seizures. And I had not seen a lot of people getting benefit. It was,
Mm-hmm.
in traditional mental health and psychiatric work, it was mostly holding patterns and palliative work and sort of this like revolving door of people coming and going. So you'd get somebody stable who was a teen and they'd spend a few days in the hospital, and they would leave and be discharged into an environment that wasn't supportive. And a couple of weeks later, would see the same kid back again, again and again and again. And a lot
Wow.
of this was childhood trauma,
Mm.
anxiety, and impulsivity in the population that I was seeing in the hospital. But a lot of kids who are autistic and nonverbal, I just didn't see a lot of change happening. And then I got this job at this place in Providence, Rhode Island, called the Neurodevelopment Center. It's still there,
Mm-hmm.
and was seeing in 6 or 8 weeks dramatic changes in executive function, sensory issues, stimming, seizures, sleep, bedwetting, obsessiveness, all kinds of things just changing. And so parents would come in after a few weeks of neurofeedback and be like, "Oh, the school called home and was super happy. We finally put Jimmy on stimulants. Ha, we didn't. We did this other
Mm.
thing." So that really blew my mind because it kind of flew in the face of what I thought was possible for
Mm-hmm.
making changes in brains. And after a couple of years of that, I went back to grad school because at the time, the field, I mean, it's still somewhat of a niche area. It's a bit of an art to do neurofeedback. You have to understand the brain and people and learning and a bunch of stuff at once. But 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, it was all, 3 or 4 schools of thought that were in sort of vitriolic opposition, fighting each other. So my way is the best way. No, my way. A bunch of crabs in buckets trying to clamber to the top and be the most legit. And yet it was
Mm-hmm.
a really nichey kind of random little corner of mental health. To give you an idea how long ago it was, we were arguing on the Usenet. So for
Mm-hmm.
folks that don't know, that's before like Facebook and modern forums
Mm.
and things. It's an old school like news servers, and you'd have these news mailing lists come out every day. And so you had these, all the greats in the field would sit and like pen these really aggressive letters yelling at each other about how, no, it doesn't work that way. No, this is the best way to do it. No, it must work like this. And yet, of the 3 big schools of thought that were all, proclaiming they had the solution, all 3 of them had better results than traditional
Mm.
mental health, dramatically better. And
Mm-hmm.
yet the ideas under those 3 different parts of our field at the time were not reconcilable. Brain couldn't work in all those ways. So somebody was, maybe many of us were not really understanding what we were doing. So I sort of saw this as a blind men and elephant situation, describing a piece of what you've got and
Mm-hmm.
extrapolating poorly from there. And I went back to grad school at UCLA, and I studied cognitive neuroscience, which is sort of the way the brain produces the mind and behavior, and did a lot of work assessing or learning to assess brains, looking at how each resource operates in a hemispheric way, lateralized
Mm-hmm.
division of stuff, which is really important for a neurodivergent population. One of the biggest things that's quite different in us who don't have typical brains is our brains are not left, right, lateralized the same way as most people's. So you
Right.
might not be lefty, but you probably, if you're neuroquirky or neurospicy, you probably do have a brain that's got left-right divisions. It's a little unusual and not like
Mm-hmm.
everyone else's. I mentioned earlier, for me, that meant 2 language areas. And I'm also strongly left-handed. And I have a few other quirky lefty things that come along with that. But you sort of seeing this unusual brain. And then in our field, we had people working with really unusual brains. And
Mm-hmm.
you have gifted individuals making uh, a lot of benefit for individuals they're working with, but the field wasn't really well. Um, it couldn't just do replicable work across people. You needed gifted people to do the work. So went back to grad school, and I studied not just laterality, but EEG and how to do
Mm-hmm.
assessments. And then I did a PhD work. My grad work for my dissertation was on, well, how is this happening? What is actually happening in the brain when you do neurofeedback? Because up until that point, nobody knew.
Mm.
There was no double-blind studies before that. I think I did the first placebo-controlled sham double-blind study, or one of the first. A couple were happening about the same time that I started. But I did my dissertation work in like 2009, 2010 or so, and then wrote it up afterwards. So the field of neurofeedback was discovered in the mid 60s in this
Okay.
form, and EEG was discovered 100 years ago this year. So it's not that new as
Mm-hmm.
science and medicine goes, but neurofeedback is really new. It's only, 60 years old or so. And only for the past maybe 15 years have you been able to do really good research. Um, so I studied this stuff. How is it working? How does the brain know? So for folks that are wondering what the heck we're talking about, maybe I should explain
Yeah.
what it is, and then I'll explain if you want to get really geeky, what I actually found, because I
Sure.
don't usually do that on podcasts. Um, so neurofeedback is a process of involuntarily exercising the brain, basically. You
Mm-hmm.
can't control your brain waves. You can't feel them. They're sort of sub-perceptible. Biofeedback is generally taking something that's not perceptible, raising up the level of perceptibility, like your heartbeat or your body temperature or something, skin temperature. And then you work on voluntarily controlling something because it's now aware. That's biofeedback, peripheral biofeedback.
Mm-hmm.
Central biofeedback on the brain, also called neurofeedback, is involuntary because you can't feel the phenomena that you're trying to train. So you end up exercising a resource and then noticing afterwards, did it shift briefly in the right direction? And then it wears off. And if you like
Mm-hmm.
the effect, you do it again. It's sort of iterative personal training in some ways. So let me give you a practical example. Maybe we should give you an example, give us an example in executive function.
Yes, that would be a good one.
So from an EEG perspective, there's a handful of things you can pretty reliably see that sort of scaffold or support executive function. They're not the only things involved, but there's some big gross resources, if you will, that are visible on a brain map. You can see them sticking up. And they're among the most valid and reliable features we see in a map too. They often mean, they're conserved across people. They mean what we think they mean usually. And those are two big circuits sort of between the crown and the ear on either side and the center of the head. The left one, the left mid-central cortex, its job is to stabilize the mode you're in. So it keeps the car pointed in the right direction, the headlight on the road in front of you, even if things are boring. And it uses beta waves to do its job. And the one on the right is a supervisor. It knows if you're on the road. It's reading the map, it's orienting, it knows if you're appropriately engaging with the behavior you want to engage with. So left side is the stabilizer, right side is the supervisor. And they both use beta waves to do their job. The one on the left has a tendency to make other slow brain waves called thetas and alphas. Theta is a release in the brain and alpha is a neutral. The one on the right tends to produce lots of theta as well. If you're dominant in those slower brain waves, if you make lots of alpha on the left, that circuit can't stabilize our focus and we start to drift and wander with our attention instead of having it remain stable. We call that inattentiveness. The one on the right, we want to be doing internal direction of focus and reacting to things we wish to. But if it's not active, if it's making lots of theta, then the outside world grabs us with whatever is interesting. Squirrel. And we call that impulsivity or disinhibition. And you can have these features. We all have these circuits. These can be not operating ideally for you with or without a diagnostic label. Actually, with or without ADHD. You can have issues in the left from deep fatigue, issues in the right from anxiety, perhaps. So the circuits will operate at a lower level than the diagnostic framework, if you will. And that's useful. Looking at your brain, you can figure out the different resources without worrying about what it's called. It's more like, well, here it is. What do you want to do? Is it important? And that's really freeing to some people to see their brains. So if you wanted to change, if you wanted to improve your inattentiveness and your impulsivity, it's a very classic way we go after stuff in neurofeedback. The average workout or exercise in neurofeedback is about half an hour long. You do it 3 or 4 times a week. And you would put a few wires on your head. So a couple ear clips. And you might stick a wire on the left-hand side for the first 15 minutes and the right-hand side for the next 15 minutes. And for both of those chunks of time, you set the computer up to measure what your brain is doing moment to moment. Measure the beta waves, measure the theta waves moment to moment. As your brain makes these things, they're going to change a little bit. And whenever the brain briefly moves in the right direction, the beta comes up on its own, the theta comes down. The computer sees that and goes, oh, good job, brain, and makes a game on the screen start to move. And the brain says, whoa, stuff, kind of like stuff. Hey, stuff. And then it moves in the wrong direction. The alpha comes back up on the left, let's say. The game slows down or stops. And the brain says, hey, I don't like no stuff. Where's my stuff? It happens to move in the right direction again a couple seconds later, and the applause continues. The brain starts to notice, oh, raising beta, lowering alpha on the left makes stuff happen? Okay. And it has no idea it's not a real thing that you're trying to do in the outside world. The big trick is we move the criteria. Every few seconds, we adjust the computer next to where your brain is. So as you shift, you're always being tracked. And then when the brain flexes itself in the right direction, that's what triggers the applause. One thing out of a billion things the brain is doing. And so the brain starts to notice these repetitive bursts
The patterns.
of information that are only yoked to one thing or two things the brain is doing. And that's what I did for my dissertation work. I set up 4 groups of people, and I did a left side beta, a left side low beta training as 2 separate protocols, a right side low beta training, and then a sham training when the beeps and the information wasn't actually tied to their brain. It was coming off of stored data on disk, not their real data. And so what I found, you guys can Google me and pull up my open access dissertation. What I found was the brain reacts to the frequency being applauded. So if you're applauding beta, you get a burst of beta right after the beeps happen, telling the brain, good job for making the beta. The brain then desynchronizes, makes a burst of strong beta. And it happens under the location you're measuring. So if you're measuring the left, you get a desynchronization, a burst in beta on the left. If you're rewarding on the right, it happens on the right. If you're rewarding sham, it doesn't happen. You don't get a burst of beta waves in response to the stimulus. You only get like just basic input-output sensory brain waves happening. So In one paper, I demonstrated lateralized effect, left to right hemisphere, where you put the wire matters, which frequency you measure and train matters, and it works when it's real and doesn't work when it's sham. And so you would think this is a pretty basic research, but up until that point, up until the late 2000s, we still weren't sure, that we were still arguing in the field. Does it matter where you put the electrode? Does it matter what the location is and the frequency is? Or is this just an exercise phenomenon? If you just give the brain back any information, will it figure it out? Turns out, no. Site matters, frequency matters. And if you're doing real training, you can see it happen in the brain in real time. So that was my dissertation work. And then from there, I went back out into the world and started opening up neurofeedback practices to help people dig through their own brain data and their assessment data, come up with ideas. And I started doing it in like an addiction and alcohol and acute environment. And really rapidly, even in that environment, I started to realize, wait a minute, teaching somebody how their brain works on their data, it doesn't create the immediate change that they're looking for their anxiety, their cravings, their impulsivity, whatever it is. But just sitting down and showing somebody their impulsivity and their high theta on the right that's producing that, and describing to them how that physiology is arranged and what it's doing and how it serves them. I'm basically telling somebody something they already know if I'm doing it right. And they're going, wow, yeah, that's me. Oh my gosh, yeah, that's me. At the end of that conversation, their big suffering or goals aren't dramatically different, but it's a lot harder to be overwhelmed, ashamed, confused, and feel like this thing is happening to you. And instead, you start thinking about the resources and you start wondering what you can do about them. And I can often give people behavioral strategies, biohacks, of technique, sleep hacks and exercise things and dietary things, meditation things that will actually move those resources. So really quickly, I moved into this non-diagnostic, sort of medical way of doing this, where instead we teach people how to think about themselves through data. We ask them not, is this diagnosis right? But is there a goal here I'm seeing for you? Are you impulsive? Are you inattentive? Are you having word finding issues? Are you having sensory filtering? Do you not pick up face expressions real well? Whatever it is, you can see those features in the map. And I'm not judging and saying, oh, you have autism or oh, you have ADHD. I'm saying, oh, look, you're kind of impulsive. And also you're really not well rested. That sounds right? Okay. Not sure where it's coming from, but clearly your deep sleep is a great goal. And so is this impulsivity. Does that sound right? It does. Well, then great. These become things we can now build neurofeedback plan for. And 3-4 sessions in, you start feeling neurofeedback. Not the first session usually, but 3-4 sessions in. And then after that, every session produces an after effect. And you get a little flex in your brain for a few hours to maybe as much as a day, where you notice changes in the big resources, the stress, the sleep, the attention, maybe some sensory filtering, maybe some anxiety. And then it kind of wears off. And you're like, huh, I might have noticed something. I might have felt different. My mother-in-law called and I wasn't mad at the end of the call. It was weird. Or whatever it is. Like, oh, I sat down and do some homework and I just did it. It was kind of weird. This is kind of silly, but I get calls from parents all the time between like weeks like 3 and 6. Calls are like, oh my God, I asked my kid to take the trash out. I asked once. He got up and did it. What are you doing to my kid? I asked one time. Or a call comes home from school. Thank you for finally putting your kid on medication. Oh, actually, we didn't.
Right.
And all the time. Or I get calls from the spouses of really uptight CEOs. Oh, whatever you did, do more of it. We had the best therapy session. He was talking about his emotions. It was weird. It was awesome. He brought me flowers. Do more of that creativity work you guys are doing. Because the creativity neurofeedback also produces emotional access, flow states, awareness of your emotions. So you can kind of use techniques for a goal, but you're working on resources. You go to the gym because you want a nicer butt. Well, guess what? You also get really gorgeous thighs and your balance is nice and your sleep is deeper. And when you have that heavy thing to pick up in the middle of the road, you can do it. So the resources, once they're made more robust, once you trust them more, you feel them changing, it starts to change your behavior pretty broadly. Because if I took you out of an old beaten up car that's hard to drive and you weren't sure you wanted to, and the brakes didn't work right and it runs out of gas a lot, versus putting you in a car that everything's just perfect and responds how you want and you can trust it, people start leaning in and pushing themselves harder, trying harder. Procrastination drops away. People get excited about things. And this is true of almost without, concern about age or functional level. If you give somebody more access to the resources, they generally want to use them. And so it's just kind of letting people be free to do the things they want to do with their brain is sort of how we end up, building our approach.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to like how the neurofeedback has specifically helped neurodivergence with some of their
Yeah.
I guess you could say goals. Like you've been using that word a lot of what they
Yeah.
want to work on.
I
Like
really
the
prefer goals to symptoms or
yeah.
complaints because people are so weird that, once you give somebody a label or a complaint or a symptom, it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily fit them. People are not their diagnoses, and the word someone uses for a diagnostic feature might not be the same subjectively from one person to the next. But when I go over brain map data and I can find the unusual stuff and say, hey, are you having sensory difficulty or language production or speed of processing? Or a lot of the time in those of us who are neurospicy, neurodivergent, you get broad changes in sleep, stress, and attention. Those are the big three foundations that human brains have
Okay.
to deal with, and those do get a little quirky. ADHD, anxiety, sensory, social, whatever. Those things can be a little quirky, but they're changeable. That's the thing. A lot of the things that uh, I would consider neurodivergent, I also put in the same category as regulatory. So there's features in the
Mm-hmm.
brain that do not change easily. Visual fusion, making one image out of two. If you don't have good visual fusion by the age of 1 year old, you probably never will.
Mm.
Language, if you haven't learned how to say certain sounds or hear sounds in a language by age 9, you probably won't. The brain prunes away after a critical period. It locks down change in language tissue and in visual processing tissue because it's so complicated that it needs to be structured and then kind of left alone.
Mm-hmm.
But other things are meant to keep changing. The executive function, the sleep regulation, the sensory filtering, the social cueing is actually meant to keep changing. And then other things you can see change as a consequence of the brain not being optimal, like speed of processing will get completely thrown off if your deep sleep is lousy. So I can take one look at someone's brain who's in their mid years and say, you're having word finding issues? And they go, well, yeah, tip of the tongue, it's really in the way. Yeah, that's not your memory. That's your speed of processing. And the reason it
Mm.
appears to be off is because your delta waves are super high and in the foreground. Probably means you aren't getting good deep sleep. And therefore, you're walking around all day kind of tired. And one of the consequences of that is your brain is tired and can't hand off information between parts of the brain real well. So you're like, oh, give me a word. Here it is. Here's the word. You kind of keep
Mm-hmm.
missing it as you reach for it as a timing mismatch. So when I find someone's speed of processing or tinnitus or trauma response, you can see threat sensitivity in the back midline. The lifeguard in the brain is sort of like, watch the road, watch the road, watch the road. I don't know
Mm.
if the person's experiencing tons of anxiety or if they're actually a lifeguard or a mom with 9 kids who's very effective at managing the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know your brain's kind of quirky and unusual. And I can say, look, your posterior cingulate kind of active often. That means somebody is experiencing some rumination, kind of worried and threat sensitive. Is that true for you? Oh, it is. Ah, that's so frustrating. Sorry you're dealing with that. Is that in the way? Would you like to work on that? You do. Okay, great. So those are the big features: the executive, the anxiety stuff, including the more subtle anxiety. And then I would build a plan that should move those things. Okay, a little more beta here than you might want, not enough alpha, but I'm not sure. People are weird,
Mm-hmm.
really, really quirky. So the goal is not to say, I understand you from the data any more than I would understand you from a diagnosis you walked in. You're a lot more rich and nuanced than those things. So you start moving people's brains a little bit and then you progressively iterate based on what they notice. And I've had an awful lot of people with some neurodivergent qualities, so to speak. I mean, I would say that well over half my clients don't have typical brains. Um, and the word neurodivergent means so many things, especially
Right.
these days. But if we go back 10, 20 years, it kind of means low key or not so low key learning disability with anxiety and with ADHD. And you might get other things, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, other, sensory processing, social processing, but it's kind of a giant umbrella at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go back 10, 20 years, I've had a lot of people who would have been diagnosed with Asperger's, let's say, or high functioning autism 20 years ago. And now the diagnostic landscape is a bit different. Many of those folks, I would say almost all, if you're cognitively intact and your language is intact, that's the stuff, again, it's hard to change. So if that stuff's good, the other stuff almost without fail can be changed. So several kids I've worked with, I say kids because I met them when they were like 12, 13, 14, and very classic presentation, very intelligent, absurdly anxious, obsessive, phobias, sensory issues, maybe some stimming. They're picking up social information, but it's awkward. They're really anxious. They're geeky. And the two that I'm thinking of off the top of my head both had artistic skills that were just amazing. One was a pianist and one was a sculptor. But they had an awful lot of broad challenges. And when I met them, the parents were both worried that this kid's never going to be independent because I can't have him in the back seat over a bridge or he freaks out. After an hour being in social environments, he shuts down. So very classic kind of, the system being flooded stuff in both of these people. And this is a long time ago, so I'm picking them. I've worked with these two people off and on. One of them graduated valedictorian from his high school a few years later. Wow. And he's actually opening up neurotech companies now as the CEO and leading people and, making big inroads into making change. The other one is running his own jazz trios. He teaches jazz and he runs trios. He travels the country and runs and sits in on jazz trios. He couldn't even drive. He drove from the Midwest to California a few years ago. And he's like, Andrew, this is the biggest sign that I'm different. My parents were concerned I would never leave the basement. And I'm living in my own apartment in Santa Monica alone. And I drove across country and it felt awesome. And I have new students and new teachers I'm working with and I'm not bothered by it. So, it's a very specific person's example, but I didn't say to this person, oh, I'm going to fix your developmental atypicality. I didn't tell his parents, oh, we're going to fix his social function. I said, well, what's in the way? Oh, it's this obsessiveness and these phobias and the sensory. Okay, let's work on that stuff. But by working on the brain, not the diagnosis, this guy you would never know he had any diagnoses ever. He's just a gentle, happy, emotionally sensitive musician whose music is amazing. And, I can go through kid after kid after kid. I often get a lot of kids in their teen years, and I get a lot of like 40s and 50s. So people come in often when they're young or when they're older. And I often get the 40s. I'm not convinced this is a real thing, but I get a lot of women who are 40, 45, 50 with their very first diagnosis from somebody else. And they come in like, oh, my doctor said I have ADHD or I have some autism or I have some like sensory processing issue. I didn't know that. Often it's because the menopause has taken out the sleep. And without the sleep to support the resources, suddenly you can see the distractibility, the speed of processing, the sensory filtering. Because when you're rested and resourced, can resist a lot of that stuff. We can kind of push through our impulsivity or our inattentiveness. But if your sleep is thrown off and you have some increased anxiety or fatigue or aging, suddenly these, let's call them subacute, neuroatypical things can suddenly burst through and get in the way. So I see a lot of folks in their 40s and 50s when they get a little burnt out and things can rise to the surface.
Yeah, I was also curious because hopefully what you can do with these episodes on this podcast, Living with Invisible Learning Challenge, I would like to challenge you to journal about the episodes and just see what you learn from them. Or you can share about the episodes with your friends and family and see what they can learn from them. And as always, I will post the links to the articles that I use in the description of the podcast. And please let me know if you know somebody who you think would want to be interviewed on this podcast, or if you yourself would want to be interviewed. please email me. I have my email on my website, and I also have it pretty much pretty accessible on Facebook and Instagram through messaging as well. So you can get in contact with me in those ways.